I grabbed coffee with an old friend last week. For years, he was the most relentlessly driven guy I knew. The kind of person who would drag you out for a 5 a.m. workout and enthusiastically pitch ambitious ideas over breakfast. But over the last 6 months, he started a new corporate job and began spending all his free time with a specific group of deeply cynical coworkers. When we sat down, he casually mentioned he had just withdrawn his name for a major promotion. I expected him to say he was pivoting careers or launching his own venture. Instead, he leaned back, gave this weary, almost defeated smirk and said, "Why even bother? Trying hard is just giving the suits free labor. The whole game is rigged anyway." It was incredibly jarring. The heavy sigh, the exact phrasing, it was like a completely different person had been downloaded into his brain. But the real turning point happened when I gently pointed out that he was sounding exactly like the notoriously bitter colleagues he used to complain about. I thought he would laugh it off or realize the irony. Instead, his posture immediately stiffened, and he got intensely defensive. "No, man," he insisted, his voice completely serious. "This is just who I am now. I've finally woken up to reality." That instantaneous reaction left me quietly stunned. He couldn't see the invisible strings at all. To him, slowly absorbing this heavy, chronic complaining from the room he spent 40 hours a week in didn't feel like a subtle behavioral shift. It felt like an authentic evolution of his own identity. It really makes you stop and wonder. When we proudly defend our habits, our reactions, and our attitudes, how much of that is actually us? And how much is just a lingering echo of the room we've chosen to stay in?
Yeah, I mean, what makes that coffee shop encounter so unnerving is that your friend wasn't experiencing a temporary lapse in motivation, right? It wasn't just a bad mood.
Right, it felt permanent.
Exactly. You were actually watching a deeply invisible cognitive architecture actively running its programming. Like, to even begin to understand how a seemingly autonomous adult undergoes that kind of instantaneous psychological rewrite, we have to dismantle the foundational myth of the human mind.
Okay, what myth is that?
Well, we operate under this persistent, comforting illusion that we are independent, rational actors. We view ourselves as like blank slates with fixed internal preferences, moving through the world and making isolated choices based on our own intrinsic logic.
Sure, I think we all like to believe we're the captain of our own ship.
Totally. But the biological and sociological reality is that our brains operate almost identically to modern predictive text engines. Think about the massive artificial intelligence models that power text generation.
Like the big language models.
Exactly. They don't have an inherent personality. They just guess the next most logical word based on the mathematical context of the sentence and the specific boundaries of the vast database they were trained on.
Right.
And the human mind is executing a remarkably similar function in social environments. We walk into a room, whether it's a corporate boardroom or a family dinner, and our subconscious immediately begins scraping the environment for social data.
So it's looking for cues, like what kind of data?
Posture, tone, vocabulary, unspoken hierarchies. It compiles all this data in milliseconds to answer one fundamental orienting query. What does a person such as I do in a situation such as this?
Wow.
Yeah. And the answer to that query simply becomes our behavior.
I am stuck on this idea of the brain as a social autocomplete program.
Mm-hmm.
It fundamentally challenges, everything we hold sacred about our own individuality, doesn't it? Because if we are constantly running this subconscious query, then the data we feed the query dictates the output. And to really visualize how this invisible architecture of apathy gets constructed, like how someone goes from a 5 a.m. go-getter to a defeated cynic, I want to look at a historical case that maps perfectly onto modern corporate life.
It's the story from 1586.
Yes, the story of young Secretary Lin in the winter of the 14th year of Emperor Wanli's reign. The historical records of the time are incredibly detailed, and they actually describe the sensory environment of the Bureau of Records.
Which is fascinating, the fact that they recorded those sensory details.
Exactly. The air in that office always smelled faintly of sour plum and rotting wood.
Presumably from damp paper and ancient floorboards, right?
Exactly. And when Lin first arrived, he brought his own premium pine soot ink from his home province. He was young, fiery, and absolutely committed to a singular, explicit goal. He was going to clear a staggering 5-year backlog of provincial famine reports.
A classic, highly motivated new hire.
Totally. And from day one, he utterly despised his 3 older deskmates. The records describe these older clerks as gray men with graying minds.
That is a brutal description.
Right. They spent their mornings methodically peeling roasted melon seeds, cracking the shells with their teeth, and their afternoons complaining about the damp draft coming through the paper windows, their aching joints, and the sheer, inescapable futility of their low rank.
It's the 16th century equivalent of the break room complainers.
Absolutely. And old Ma, the most senior clerk in the room, had this signature move. He would wave a dismissive, ink-stained hand at a misplaced tax ledger and mutter, "The emperor doesn't read these. Why should we?"
See, that phrase from old Ma is the perfect encapsulation of entrenched institutional precedent.
So,
It is a highly compressed packet of social data that carries the entire behavioral code of that specific room. It tells any new entrant that effort is not just unrewarded, it is actively viewed as naive.
and Lin recognized that toxicity immediately. He swore to himself that he would never become one of these living corpses.
Good for him, at first anyway.
Right, at first. He kept his head down, grinding his premium pine soot ink, working furiously, gritting his teeth against their endless, suffocating chorus of apathy.
So he was actively resisting the room's data?
Was making a conscious, defiant choice every single day to reject the autocomplete suggestion of the room. But the architecture of the space was working against him. The room was tiny. The charcoal braziers they used for heat meant the windows had to be kept tightly shut against the bitter Beijing cold.
Oh man, so the air in there must have been incredibly stale.
Yeah, Lin was quite literally breathing in their exhaled sighs. So watch the gradual biological erosion. By his third winter in that closed room, Lin found that his premium pine soot ink had dried out in its wooden box.
And let me guess, he didn't replace it.
Instead of requisitioning more from his family, he just started dipping his brush into the Bureau's cheap, sour ink. It was simply less friction.
Wow.
And by his fifth winter, he realized he was leaving the office an hour earlier than he used to, convincing himself that the dim afternoon light was bad for his eyes.
Which is the slow, mechanical failure of explicit intentions over the sustained pressure of an environment.
Right. But the true horror, the moment that perfectly mirrors my friend staring at me over coffee, didn't arrive with some dramatic epiphany where Lin consciously decided to give up. It happened on a random, quiet Tuesday.
It always sneaks up on you.
A new bright-eyed scholar from Suzhou was assigned to their desk. This kid came in furious and unrolling a stack of neglected agricultural petitions, vibrating with that exact same naive energy Lin had possessed 5 years earlier.
Fun.
Lin watched the boy organize his brushes. And without thinking, without any conscious deliberation, Lin reached into his heavy winter sleeve, pulled out a handful of roasted melon seeds, cracked one between his teeth, and sighed.
He became old Ma.
He looked at the boy and said the exact words. "Pace yourself, boy. The emperor doesn't read these. Why should we?"
Unbelievable.
The words tasted of sour plum and ash in his mouth. He had not chosen to surrender his ambition. The room had simply digested him.
You know, Lin's transformation is a chillingly pure illustration of what cognitive scientists and researchers in artificial intelligence refer to as the society-first theory of cognition.
The society-first theory.
So if we strip this down to the mechanics, we have to look at how recent breakthroughs in AI, specifically research by teams at Google DeepMind exploring multi-agent reinforcement learning, have totally revolutionized our understanding of human behavior.
Okay.
For decades, the dominant sociological model was methodological individualism, which is essentially rational choice theory.
And that means what exactly?
That older model assumes we are entirely under-socialized agents. It assumes Lin possesses a fixed, immovable internal utility function, like a permanent set of desires, ambitions, and work ethics.
Right, like his soul is unchangeable.
Exactly. And it assumes that every day he sits at his desk and rationally calculates the costs and benefits of working hard versus slacking off. But the society-first framework, mirroring how neural networks learn, completely dismantles that.
Wow.
Yeah, it posits that individuals operate primarily via predictive pattern completion.
Wait, let's slow down and translate the biology of that, because the distinction between how Lin tried to survive and how his brain actually functioned is where the trap lies, right?
Right.
You're saying Lin failed because he was relying on two completely different operating systems in his brain. Like, he was fighting an implicit environment with an explicit rule.
That is the core biological conflict right there. We have to separate explicit norms from implicit norms. Explicit norms are the deliberate, articulated rules you give yourself.
Like Lin saying, "I will clear this backlog."
Or, I will go to the gym at 5 a.m. Biologically, processing an explicit norm happens largely within the hippocampal memory system and the prefrontal cortex. When Lin sits down and tells himself to work hard, he is actively retrieving a goal into the global workspace of his brain.
Which takes effort.
It is intensely calorically expensive. The human brain is only about 2% of our total body weight, but it consumes 20% of our resting energy. Sustaining conscious, deliberate resistance against the grain of an environment drains metabolic resources incredibly fast.
So it's basically cognitive heavy lifting.
Exactly.
So if the hippocampus is essentially the computer's RAM handling active, energy-intensive tasks, then the implicit norms, the unspoken behaviors of old Ma peeling melon seeds and sighing, are bypassing the RAM entirely.
They are writing directly to the hard drive. Implicit norms guide our behavior but strongly resist verbal formulation. They are the atmospheric pressures, the microexpressions, the baseline tempo of the room.
And Lynn was swimming in that atmospheric pressure for 5 years.
Right. Through sheer repetition, spending 5 winters in a freezing, closed room where every social reward is tied to lethargy, these implicit behaviors consolidate into the neocortical pattern completion network.
Tech.
Yeah, this is the exact same neurological process that allows you to drive a car or ride a bicycle without consciously calculating the angle of the steering wheel.
You just do it automatically.
The neocortex absorbs the repeated patterns of the environment to save energy. Lynn didn't wake up on a Tuesday and make a conscious, rational decision to become lazy.
His brain's predictive engine had just spent 5 years updating its parameters to match the dominant data it was receiving.
When the new scholar arrived, the social context triggered Lynn's neocortical network to output the most highly probable sequence of behaviors for a senior clerk in that specific spatial geometry. Crack a melon seed, sigh, and dismiss the work.
I am going to stubbornly push back on this, because I refuse to accept a model of humanity that paints us as helpless victims of our own neural efficiency.
It's a tough pill to swallow, for sure.
I mean, I hear predictive pattern completion and updating parameters, and it sounds like a complete erasure of human free will. Like, I chose my career. I choose what I eat for breakfast. I choose to push myself.
You feel like you're in the driver's seat.
Exactly. You're suggesting that my ambition, my drive, my very essence is nothing more than a downloaded script from the people sitting in the cubicles next to me. If I am just an organic AI predicting the next word, where does I exist?
The resistance to this idea is profound, and it touches on the deepest philosophical anxieties we have about our own autonomy.
Yeah, natural.
We inherently lean toward existentialism, right? The idea that we define our own essence through pure, unadulterated choice. But to understand the true nature of agency, we have to look at the concept of endogenous preference formation.
Endogenous preference formation.
Yes. The flaw in your defense of free will is the assumption that your preferences, what you want for breakfast, your desire for a promotion, your ambition are fixed, exogenous variables that you were simply born with.
Okay, and this framework argues what?
The Society First framework argues that preferences are entirely endogenous. They are generated from within, yes, but they are caused and constructed by the outside environment.
Wait, so you are saying my friend at the coffee shop didn't just adopt a cynical persona to fit in at the new job. The corporate environment actually reached inside him and rewired his capacity to want things.
His fundamental desires were overwritten. When classical economics looks at a human, it assumes you have a taste for art, a drive for wealth, or a preference for hard work, and you move through the world trying to maximize those fixed traits.
Right, maximizing utility.
But sociologists looking at endogenous preference formation see that the weight of precedent in an environment literally shapes what you find desirable. When your friend said, "This is just who I am now," his neocortex was accurately reporting its current state.
Wild.
The I that was speaking to you had genuinely changed because the training data had changed. The brain abhors the massive caloric cost of being misaligned with its primary social group.
Because standing out is exhausting.
Yes. So to reduce that cognitive friction, it doesn't just change your outward behavior, it authentically adjusts your internal tastes and desires until they harmonize with the room. We are constantly, in real time, co-authoring our core identities with the people we share space with.
That reframes the entire concept of personality from a permanent structure into a temporary adaptation.
It does.
It explains why my friend defended his new apathy so aggressively. To him, it felt like a genuine awakening, not an infection. But if it's really about the caloric burn of resisting and the brain's desire to reduce cognitive friction, it makes me wonder what happens when the pressure isn't just passive. Well, in the Bureau of Records, old Ma was just lazy. The friction Lynn faced was passive apathy. What happens when the room is actively, aggressively policing your behavior? What happens when social density turns up to a 10 and the environment demands your submission?
When you increase social density and interdependence, the metabolic cost of resisting the room becomes exponentially higher.
It's not just a slow drain anymore.
No, the environmental software update stops being a slow background download and becomes a mandatory system override.
Which brings us to the number 3 cotton mill. If Secretary Lin's story was about the slow, quiet drip of apathy, the story of Hui is about the sheer, crushing gravity of the collective. Let's look at 1970s Shanghai.
Okay.
In the densely packed sleeping quarters of the number 3 cotton mill, privacy was not considered a right. It was viewed as a highly suspicious anomaly. The architectural reality of this space is hard to fathom for anyone used to modern Western comforts.
Yeah, the density was extreme.
We are talking about 8 iron bunks, 16 young women, and exactly 1 shared enamel wash basin for the entire room.
Just a level of spatial and psychological interdependency that forces immediate behavioral conformity simply to maintain basic biological sanitation and order.
Exactly. Every single breath, every movement was public. When a young woman named Hui moved into this room from a rural countryside village, she brought with her a quiet, solitary defiance.
She was used to having space.
Right. In her village, if she wanted to be alone, she could just walk out into the vast agricultural fields. But here, the collective breathed down her neck 24 hours a day. Hui spent her meager free time reading tattered, translated Russian novels by flashlight under her heavy quilt.
Which is a desperate attempt to create a boundary.
She was actively trying to wall herself off from the relentless, swirling vortex of the room's collective energy, the intricate, petty jealousies, the shared, venomous hatred of the floor manager, the obsessive, never-ending calculations of food ration coupons.
But in a room with 16 women and 1 wash basin, her silence was not interpreted as introversion, was it?
No, it was interpreted as arrogance.
Right. By attempting to carve out an independent psychological space, she was actively violating the most critical implicit norm of that ecosystem: absolute transparency and shared emotional state.
And the turning point for Hui, the moment the room finally broke her, didn't come in the form of a threat or physical coercion. It came as a profound wave of exhaustion.
The caloric drain we were just talking about.
Exactly. The psychological friction of standing outside the circle began to physically ache. It is exhausting to be the only object in the room resisting gravity. One evening, the room was engaged in its favorite pastime, collectively tearing apart the reputation of a woman in a neighboring unit.
Bonding over gossip.
Yeah, laughing, bonding over shared malice. Hui was trying to read, trying to ignore them. Suddenly, a senior girl reached out and offered Hui a piece of stolen candied ginger.
Oh, that is such a loaded gesture.
In that environment, to refuse the ginger was to declare open, permanent warfare on the collective. It would mean total ostracization in a room where you couldn't even wash your face without cooperation.
And to accept it was to join the hive. The candy ginger is a classic mechanism of social enforcement. It is an offering that carries an immense unspoken contract.
Hui took the ginger. She chewed it, and she forced to laugh at a cruel joke she didn't even find funny.
The tension must have just vanished.
Years later, she described that exact moment as feeling like stepping into a painfully warm bath after freezing in the snow for hours. The sheer relief of belonging washed away the sharp, exhausting edges of her individuality.
The caloric cost of maintaining her separate self was finally zero.
Yeah, the months bled into years. Her tattered Russian novels were quietly traded away for extra wool. And the ultimate, tragic completion of her neural rewrite happened a decade later.
She became the enforcer, didn't she?
She did. A new, quiet girl arrived from the provinces and immediately retreated to a corner to read a book. Hui, the woman who used to read under her quilt, was the very first person in the room to scoff loudly at the new girl's arrogance.
Wow.
Her voice had become indistinguishable from the harmonious, crushing chorus of the room. The space had swallowed her original self whole.
See, Hui's story forces us to examine cultural multipliers. The biological mechanisms of the brain, predictive pattern completion, neocortical shifting, those are universal. But the cultural context acts as a massive amplifier or dampener for environmental influence.
Right, because not every culture values blending into that extreme degree.
Exactly. We have to analyze the fundamental differences between individualistic and collectivist societies to understand why Hui stood no chance. Cultural psychologists draw a sharp line between influence goals and adjustment goals.
Okay, so an influence goal is the classic Western ideal, like the idea that I must bend the universe to my will.
In highly individualistic societies, the primary social directive, the explicit cultural norm, is the influence goal. From childhood, you are taught to assert your preferences, to change your environment, to suit your personal needs, to be the squeaky wheel that gets the grease right, to disrupt the space.
Be a trailblazer, all of that.
Exactly. But in highly interdependent collectivistic cultures, like the Shanghai Mill of the 1970s, the paramount directive is the adjustment goal.
Meaning you adjust to the room, not the other way around.
The aim is not to change the room. The aim is to seamlessly alter your own internal needs, behaviors, and desires to maintain harmony with the environment.
So for Hui, attempting to run the software of an influence goal, reading her solitary novels, ignoring the group dynamics while physically trapped in an adjustment goal environment, cause a catastrophic systems failure.
She didn't just surrender out of weakness. Her brain executed an emergency adjustment goal to ensure her psychological and social survival.
It's like trying to run iOS on an Android phone. The hardware of the room simply will not support the software you are trying to use, so it forcefully formats your hard drive. But I want to take this even deeper, because if the culture dictates whether we lean toward influence or adjustment, does it also dictate how we actually feel when we achieve those goals? Like, does the room just change our outward behavior, or does it program our literal emotions?
It absolutely programs our emotions, and this is where the science gets incredibly granular.
I love granular.
To understand how culture writes our emotional code, we look at affect valuation theory, or AVT.
AVT.
Affect valuation theory proposes a vital distinction in our emotional landscape. It separates actual affect, which is the raw biological reality of how you feel right now, whether you are tired, hungry, or stressed, from ideal affect.
And ideal affect is what you want to feel.
Exactly. Ideal affect is the specific emotional state you inherently value, crave, and actively strive to achieve. It is the destination your brain is always trying to navigate toward. ABT proves that while actual affect is largely biological, ideal affect is almost entirely constructed by the cultural room you were raised in.
So culture doesn't just tell you what job to get, it tells you what flavor of happiness you're supposed to want.
Yeah.
But how do researchers even measure something that subjective?
Oh, they look at the cultural artifacts we produce, specifically through the lens of the facial action coding system, known as FACS.
FACS, I've heard of that, the microexpression thing.
Yeah, developed initially by Paul Ekman. FACS is an anatomically based system that catalogs every single observable movement of the human face. It breaks facial expressions down into specific action units.
Okay, give me an example of an action unit.
For example, action unit 12 is the contraction of the zygomatic major muscle, which pulls the lip corners up. Action unit 6 is the contraction of the orbicularis oculi, which wrinkles the skin around the eyes.
Oh, so a genuine smile.
Exactly. Researchers use this incredibly precise system to analyze children's storybooks, popular women's magazines, and even the official corporate and political portraits across different cultures.
They were coding the faces in the magazine.
Yeah, they weren't looking at what the people in the images were doing. They were meticulously coding the exact muscle contractions of their faces.
And what did the muscle contractions reveal about our cultural programming?
They revealed a stark, mathematically measurable divide in ideal affect. In American media, the children's books and leadership portraits predominantly feature high-intensity muscle contractions.
Like huge grins.
Wide open mouths, exposed teeth, widened eyes. These expressions promote what AVT classifies as high arousal positive states, or HAP.
High arousal positive. Got it.
The cultural baseline is screaming that success looks like excitement, enthusiasm, and elation.
Yeah, that tracks with basically every American commercial I've ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
What about other cultures?
Well, conversely, when they coded East Asian media, the muscle movements were remarkably subdued. The smiles are predominantly closed-mouthed, the eye contractions are gentle, the culture is constantly modeling low arousal positive states, or LAP.
Calmness, peacefulness.
Exactly. Serenity and balance. From the moment you look at a picture book, your culture is showing you the face of success and writing the code for your ideal affect.
So the American ideal is basically adding hot sauce to every single emotional meal until your taste buds demand a baseline of adrenaline just to feel alive. While the East Asian ideal is a perfectly balanced cup of green tea. But here is where I want to introduce a massive wrench into this neat cultural binary.
Okay.
I was looking at recent AVT data, and it exposes a fascinating contradiction. If we assume collectivist cultures prefer low arousal, calm states, the data generally supports that. However, a recent comparative study looked at South Asians, a traditionally collectivist culture, and Americans, You would expect the South Asians to desire fewer high-arousal states, which they did. But remarkably, the data showed a massive, unprecedented spike among Americans.
A spike in what, exactly?
Americans are suddenly showing incredibly high desires for low-arousal positive states. They want calm. They want peace. If the American cultural programming has been pumping out open-mouthed, high-arousal excitement for a century, why is the American brain suddenly crying out for the East Asian ideal effect? Did the predictive text engine break?
The engine didn't break. It is actually functioning perfectly.
So?
That contradiction is actually the ultimate proof of the society first framework. We have a tendency to view culture as a static, historical monolith, like that Americans will always want HAP and Asians will always want LAP. But culture is a living, breathing, highly reactive environmental room. The sudden American obsession with low arousal positive states. I mean, think about the explosion of meditation apps, mindfulness retreats, the entire cultural desperation for Zen that is a direct biological adaptation to an increasingly toxic environment.
Oh, because our baseline has gotten so intense.
Exactly. Think about the macro room Americans have been living in.
You mean the baseline noise? The post-9/11 security state, the 2008 financial collapse, the relentless, algorithmically driven outrage cycle of social media, a global pandemic, political polarization. It's endless.
The modern Western environment has become catastrophically saturated with high arousal negative stimuli.
High arousal negative, stress and anger.
The room is incredibly loud, incredibly fast, and constantly generating anxiety. When the baseline environment pushes your actual affect into chronic high arousal stress, the psychological immune system has to react.
It swings the pendulum the other way.
It shifts the ideal affect to compensate. The American brain is desperately pulling toward low arousal positive states because the current room is on fire.
Wow.
It proves that our deepest, most intimate emotional desires, whether we crave the thrill of a roller coaster or the silence of a monastery, do not originate from some unchangeable, isolated soul. They're dynamically sculpted by the specific acoustic, political, and social noise of the era we are actively sitting in.
That completely reframes the entire mindfulness industry. Our sudden desire for peace isn't some higher spiritual awakening. It's just our neural network desperately trying to balance out the deafening noise of our specific historical room.
Yes, it's a survival mechanism.
But this brings us to a terrifying philosophical cliff. If our daily habits are written by the people in our office, and our deepest emotional desires are written by the geopolitical and technological noise of our culture, where does that leave us? Are we just helpless sponges? If the environment writes the code, do we have any agency at all, or are we just doomed to reflect whatever room we happen to stumble into? To answer that, I want to look at a historical figure who figured out the ultimate hack to this deterministic nightmare. I want to look at the architecture of agency.
Pivot.
Let's examine the freezing room in Kyoto.
Because we have established that the environment dictates the software. The question of human agency, then, is not about resisting the software download. It is about how we gain control of the keyboard that initiates the...
Gaining control of the keyboard. Okay. The year is 1868. Japan is in the midst of a violent existential upheaval. The Tokugawa shogunate, which had ruled for centuries, is collapsing under the weight of foreign pressure and internal rebellion.
A massively volatile historical moment.
But if you stepped inside the sprawling, immaculately manicured estate of the Nakagawa merchant clan in Kyoto, you wouldn't know a revolution was happening. The air in that estate smelled of stale sake and inherited cowardice.
They were insulated.
Totally insulated. Kenjiro was the third son of this wealthy family. Every single day, he watched his older brothers and their sycophantic friends lounge on expensive silk cushions, drinking and composing hollow, utterly meaningless poetry.
While the world burned outside.
Beyond their walls, reformers, often impoverished peasant samurai, were bleeding and dying in the streets to forge a modern Japan. But Kenjiro's brothers formed a circle of comfortable ghosts. They used cynical laughter and intellectual mockery to mask their own historical irrelevance.
They were the old Ma of the 19th century, just with better funding.
Exactly.
It's an environment defined by entrenched apathy, but laced with a highly insulating layer of elitism and wealth. The implicit norm was that caring about the outside world was not just dangerous, it was vulgar.
The difference between Kenjiro and Secretary Lin, though, is self-awareness. Kenjiro felt the rot creeping up his own legs.
He noticed the parameters updating.
He noticed that when he spoke, his own tongue was sharpening with that same lazy, aristocratic sarcasm. He felt the calluses on his hands fading, his body growing soft and hesitant. Yeah. He realized with absolute clarity that if he remained in that pristine sliding paper cage, the room would digest him, and he would die a hollow, cowardly man.
Ew.
He performed a brutal unilateral surgery on his own life. Without telling his family, he packed a single, coarse cloth bundle, walked out of the estate into the freezing winter rain, and relocated to a drafty, miserable boarding house in the Choshu district.
Ow.
And the Choshu district was the epicenter of the radical rebellion.
He fundamentally understood that he could not outthink his environment, so he physically replaced the training data.
And the shock to his biological system was violent. He intentionally surrounded himself with impoverished militant reformers. These new men didn't lounge. They spoke in clipped, urgent sentences.
A totally different rhythm.
They slept on hard floors for only a few hours a night. They operated under the constant looming threat of assassination, and they demanded total, unyielding conviction from everyone in their proximity.
The contrast must have been staggering.
For the first 3 months in that boarding house, Kenjiro was paralyzed by terror and a profound sense of shame. He was the slowest, the softest, the most useless man in the room.
Right, because he was experiencing the agonizing friction of an adjustment goal, but he was actively moving from a state of comfort to a state of extreme hardship.
Yeah, his old neocortical programming screamed at him to flee back to the velvet cushions and the warm sake. The caloric cost of existing in that new room would have been staggering.
So how did he survive? Did he ask for help?
No, he didn't run. And he didn't ask the revolutionaries for their patience. He didn't ask them to slow down or soften their edges for him. He merely maintained his physical proximity to them. He forced himself to simply sit in the freezing room.
Just letting the environment do the work.
He allowed their intense, unyielding tempo to batter against his lethargy day after day. He deliberately used the terrifying, crushing pressure of this new environment to tear his old habits apart, cell by cell.
Incredible.
By simply refusing to leave the room, he forced his brain to forge a spine of iron that he was absolutely not born with.
Kenjiro's self-imposed exile is the masterclass in what sociologists call intentional peer group selection. This is how we reconcile the reality of predictive pattern completion with the human desire for free will.
Intentional peer group selection.
If we accept the biological premise that the room dictates our implicit norms, then we must accept a radical redefinition of agency. The ultimate act of free will is not standing in a toxic room and relying on your hippocampus to resist it. The ultimate act of free will is choosing the room.
You don't fight the software update.
No, you carefully curate which software is allowed to be downloaded.
It fundamentally shifts the burden of self-improvement. It stops being a test of internal willpower and becomes a test of geographic and social positioning. Think about you listening to this right now. You might be sitting in a Slack channel that is just a digital version of Kenjiro's cynical brothers. Or working in an open plan office where the implicit norm is to do the bare minimum and complain. Trying to be a high performer in that space is biologically exhausting.
And the data on human achievement completely validates this shift from internal willpower to external positioning.
Is there hard data on this?
Definitely. When we look at studies measuring goal attainment and accountability, the correlation between peer proximity and success is staggering. If an individual makes a conscious, explicit decision to achieve a difficult goal in isolation, their statistical probability of success is remarkably low.
Because the brain just can't keep up the fight.
Right. The brain simply cannot sustain the caloric burn of an isolated, explicit norm over a long timeline. However, studies demonstrate that people are 65% more likely to hit their goals if they commit to them with a single partner.
A 65% jump just by externalizing the goal to one other human being. That alone is incredible.
It is, but the data scales dramatically from there. When individuals lock themselves into a specific peer group, when they have regular structural check-ins and are totally immersed in a collective where the goal is the baseline standard, their likelihood of success skyrockets to 95%.
95%?
Yes, a 95% success rate is practically a statistical guarantee, and it is not achieved by magically generating more internal discipline. It is achieved entirely by manipulating the weight of precedent.
Just like Kenjiro.
Exactly like Kenjiro. He possessed the structural intelligence to realize he could not change the established conventions of the Nakagawa estate.
Altering a deeply entrenched cultural norm requires massive, coordinated collective action.
One soft merchant's son cannot single-handedly turn a room of cynical poets into militant revolutionaries. So instead of fighting a losing battle against the immense gravity of his family, he migrated his physical body to a microsociety where the weight of precedent already heavily favored the exact traits he desperately wanted to acquire.
It is the exact same mechanism as elite endurance athletes. Think about runners who utilize high-altitude training.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
If you are an athlete sitting at sea level, you cannot consciously force your body to produce more red blood cells. You can sit there and meditate, you can scream at your own biology, you can focus all your explicit intention on increasing your oxygen capacity, but it is biologically impossible to will it to happen.
You're just wasting energy.
However, if you intentionally place your physical body in a training camp on top of a mountain, you no longer have to think about it. The thin air of the environment does the biological work for you. The sheer lack of oxygen forces the body to adapt.
The environment acts upon the body.
You suffer intensely at first. You are gasping for air, your head throbs, you feel devastatingly weak. It is the exact physical manifestation of Kenjiro shivering in the Choshu boarding house, feeling totally inadequate.
But if you endure...
If you just endure the initial shock and stay on the mountain long enough, adaptation is not a matter of willpower. It is biologically inevitable. Your body rewrites its own baseline to survive the parameters of the new room.
The altitude does the work. Your agency was simply the conscious decision to buy the ticket and walk up the mountain. And if we take that altitude metaphor and connect it back to Kenjiro's journey and the society-first cognitive models, it forces us to confront an incredibly uncomfortable reality about human logic.
Yeah.
It forces us to completely redefine what we mean by rationality.
Redefining rationality. We are conditioned to view rationality as an immutable objective truth.
Sure we are.
Like, the logic of a decision shouldn't change just because you walked into a different room. 1 + 1 is 2, regardless of who is sitting next to you.
That is the classical Enlightenment view of objective rationality. But from an information processing perspective, when we accept that the brain is a predictive engine constantly running the "what does a person such as I do" query rationality ceases to be a fixed universal truth.
So what is it?
Rationality, in practice, is simply adherence to the justification standards of your current social context. What is logical is defined entirely by the data parameters of the room.
So the definition of a rational choice fundamentally shifts when the environment shifts.
Absolutely. Think about Kenjiro's two environments. Inside the Nakagawa merchant household, the rational behavior, based on all available social data, was to stay safe, drink sake, write poetry, and survive the collapsing regime by pretending it wasn't happening.
Which makes sense within that bubble.
To do anything else to risk your wealth and your life for an abstract political cause was considered foolish, deeply irrational, and practically suicidal. The peer group validated cowardice as supreme logic.
But the moment Kenjiro stepped into the boarding house in Choshu,
the parameters of logic inverted. In that room, the rational behavior was to sacrifice absolutely everything, including your life, for the cause of a new modern nation.
Kenjiro didn't just adopt a new set of daily habits when he moved across Kyoto. He adopted a completely new architectural framework for what constituted a rational human life.
Yes. His very definition of logic, his understanding of what made a choice correct or incorrect, was driven entirely by the peer group he intentionally immersed himself in. The training data changed, and therefore the optimal logical output of his neural network changed with it.
So when I trace this all the way back to my friend sitting across from me at the coffee shop, defensively crossing his arms and saying, "I've finally woken up to reality," I have to accept that he wasn't lying to me.
He wasn't.
He wasn't in denial. He had simply moved his physical and social body to a room that possessed a completely different reality.
And his brain brilliantly, efficiently adapted its parameters to make that new cynical reality seem like the only logical conclusion a smart person could reach. The boundary we try to draw between our authentic inner selves and our external social environment is practically non-existent. We are highly adaptive, culturally pre-trained actors. At every single moment, whether we are conscious of it or not, our brains are automatically generating our behavior, our desires, and our logic by answering that fundamental subconscious query. What does a person such as I do in a situation such as this? And the answer to that query is always, inescapably, provided by the data of the people who surround us.
Recognizing this biological and sociological reality entirely strips away the comforting illusion of the independent, unshakable personality. It means that the most deeply defended parts of our identities, the fears we harbor in our quiet moments, the ambitions we exhaust ourselves chasing, the cynicism we mistake for hard-earned wisdom, are often nothing more than the lingering artifacts of the rooms we have chosen not to leave.